Chapter 9. The Green family's townhouse, though modest compared to the grand estates of higher-ranking nobles, was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of fresh bread and old parchment. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor. It was here, in the heart of their home, that Baron Elias Green lifted his daughter into the air, spinning her around with a broad, toothy grin. "Huh! That's my Anna," he declared proudly. "I knew that brilliant mind of yours would get you places. If only your older brothers were as brilliant, we'd be drowning in titles by now." At this, his two sons, Theodore and Matthew, exchanged amused glances. Neither took offense to their father's jest, they had long grown accustomed to his sharp humor. Theodore, the eldest at 23, leaned back against the fireplace mantel, his arms crossed, while Matthew, 19, sat at the dining table, lazily twirling a quill between his fingers. "You wound me, father," Theodore said, feigning offense. "I'll have you know I negotiate some of the best trade contracts in the capital." Matthew smirked. "And I keep the books from going up in flames." "Surely, that counts for something?" Their father chuckled as he set Anna down. Yes, you boys are useful enough. But securing a position with the princess herself? Now, that is a true accomplishment." He patted Anna's head affectionately. "You brought honor to the family, my dear." Anna, still slightly flustered from all the attention, smoothed out her beige dress, trying to process the reality of it all. "I didn't expect this, truly. The princess just asked me to work for her." From across the room, her mother, Margaret Green, watched the scene unfold with quiet pride. A woman of gentle beauty, with soft brown curls streaked with silver and kind green eyes, she had once been the daughter of a respected scholar before marrying Elias. Unlike many noble wives, she had no interest in grandeur. She was content with their modest but respectable life, and above all, she valued her children's happiness. "I'm not surprised," she said, setting down a tray of tea. "You've always been a diligent learner, my dear. The princess must have recognized your talents." "She did praise my knowledge of economics," Anna admitted, shifting slightly. "But I can't help but feel nervous. What if I make a mistake?" Theodore, ever the protective older brother, scoffed. "Nonsense. If anything, you'll be the one correcting their mistakes." Matthew nodded in agreement. "Besides, working closely with the princess means you'll have access to valuable information. If you ever need help, we're here." Their father stroked his beard thoughtfully. "They're right. The court is a nest of vipers, but if you keep your wits about you, you'll do just fine. And if anyone dares to trouble you," his tone darkened slightly, "they'll have to answer to me." Anna chuckled. "I'm more worried about embarrassing myself in front of the princess than dealing with vipers." Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Just be yourself, Anna. You have nothing to prove. The princess chose you for a reason." Anna took a deep breath, nodding. She had never aspired for power or recognition, but now she stood on the precipice of something much greater than she had ever imagined. A new chapter of her life was beginning, and she was determined to make the most of it. The imperial court in uproar. The grand hall of the Imperial Palace was bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon, its towering marble columns and intricately carved arches exuding an air of undeniable majesty. A vast mosaic of the empire's crest, a golden phoenix soaring against a field of blue, sprawled across the floor beneath the noble's feet. The scent of burning incense mingled with the crisp notes of parchment and ink, a testament to the many matters of state being handled within these walls. Yet today, all discussions of trade, policy, and diplomacy had taken a back seat to a singular topic: Princess Athanasia's new secretary. The nobles stood in tight clusters, murmuring in hushed tones, their silk robes rustling as they exchanged wary glances. At the center of it all was Duke Alpheus, his usually composed expression strained as he stepped forward, bowing deeply before the emperor. "Your Majesty, surely there is someone better qualified for the position," he said carefully, his voice laced with forced diplomacy. Behind him, several high-ranking nobles nodded in agreement, their faces lined with varying degrees of concern, or, in some cases, veiled ambition. Seated upon the grand imperial throne, Emperor Claude de Alger Obelia exuded an aura of power that made even the most seasoned politicians tread lightly. His short golden hair framed a sharp, statuesque face, and his piercing jeweled blue eyes, so eerily similar to Athanasia's, glowed with a warning. Draped in a flowing white Roman-style robe, casually left open at the chest, he looked every bit the untouchable deity that the people whispered about. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Claude leaned forward slightly, resting one elbow on the arm of his throne. Then, in a voice as smooth as silk yet sharp as a dagger, he asked. "Like whom? Your sons?" A flicker of tension passed through Duke Alpheus's face, but before he could reply, the emperor's gaze turned lethal. "I don't want any of your sons near my daughter." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. The nobles stiffened, glancing warily at each other. Despite his reputation as a cold and ruthless ruler, it had become painfully obvious to the court just how protective Emperor Claude was over Athanasia. That he would ensure she was well cared for was expected. That he would go so far as to handpick a young girl with no noble ties beyond a barony, simply to ensure his daughter would not be overwhelmed or, heaven forbid, interact too closely with men, was something else entirely. The Duke composed himself quickly, his expression unreadable. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, Lady Anna Green comes from a modest background. While I do not question the princess's judgment, state affairs require experience. Would it not be wiser to appoint someone with a stronger foundation in court politics?" Claude merely leaned back against the throne, exhaling a slow, unimpressed sigh. "Athanasia is swamped with state affairs as it is," he said lazily, though his voice carried an unmistakable edge. "And while I prefer to handle matters myself, I won't have my daughter overwhelmed if I can help it." His eyes narrowed. "She says this girl is capable. That's enough." Duke Alpheus clenched his fists discreetly, frustration flickering across his features before he masked it behind a courteous bow. "Of course, Your Majesty." As the nobles hesitated, reluctant to let the matter drop so easily, Claude's voice darkened. "Or would you rather I rethink my patience?" That was all it took. The nobles instantly fell silent, bowing their heads in submission. "No, Your Majesty," they murmured in unison. Satisfied, Claude lazily flicked his wrist, dismissing them. "Then leave." The nobles turned on their heels, leaving the chamber with only whispers trailing behind them. As the last of them exited, Claude let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through his golden hair. The court was a nuisance, but nothing irritated him more than their attempts to meddle in Athanasia's affairs. As if I'd let them interfere with my daughter's life. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the gardens of the Emerald Palace could be seen in the distance. His princess would not be trapped by court schemes. Not while he still drew breath. The Sapphire Palace, though grand in its own right, was nothing compared to the splendor of the Garnet and Emerald Palace, where the emperor and his beloved daughter resided. It was meant to house esteemed guests, foreign dignitaries, and temporary residents of the imperial court. Yet, for Jeanette, it was a symbol of her lack of importance, an unspoken reminder that she was not truly a princess in the emperor's eyes. The lounge room where she now sat with Duke Alpheus was luxurious but impersonal. High ceilings were adorned with golden moldings, and a grand chandelier hung in the center, its crystals refracting the warm afternoon light. Velvet drapes in deep sapphire blue framed tall arched windows that overlooked the palace gardens. The furniture was finely crafted, mahogany tables, plush chairs, and a settee embroidered with golden threads. Yet, despite the elegance, there was no warmth. No personal touches that might make it feel like home. As the maids poured tea into porcelain cups decorated with intricate golden patterns, the Duke dismissed them with a simple, "Leave us." The maids bowed and swiftly exited, closing the doors behind them. Jeanette, dressed in a modest yet refined pale pink dress, observed her uncle carefully. He was always a composed man, his short white hair neatly styled, his golden eyes calculating as he studied her. Compared to the lavish gowns she once wore at his mansion, her current attire felt disappointingly plain. "How are the servants treating you?" he asked, lifting his teacup to his lips. "They're fine," Jeanette replied, before her irritation surfaced. "It's the other person who lives here that's the problem." Duke Alpheus arched a brow, setting his cup down. "Who else is staying here?" "Lucas, the Imperial magician." "Apparently, he's been living here for years," she huffed. "And not only that, but he has the largest room in the entire palace. He's so annoying. He even restricted me from going to certain places." The Duke's gaze sharpened slightly. "Like where?" Jeanette crossed her arms, her irritation evident. "His side of the building, some lounge rooms, parts of the gardens, and I'm not even allowed to eat in the dining room when he's there. He's just an arrogant kid." A smirk played at the Duke's lips. "Kid?" Jeanette frowned. "He's my age. His name is Lucas." The Duke hummed in thought. "Ah, the boy who took Ezekiel's place as the princess's playmate." His fingers tapped against the porcelain teacup. "I would have thought His Majesty would have gotten rid of him by now, seeing as he doesn't want any boys around the princess." Jeanette's irritation only grew at the reminder of the Emperor's favoritism. He would go so far as to keep noble sons away from Athanasia, yet allowed someone like Lucas, some unknown magician, to remain in close proximity to her? Before she could voice her frustration, the Duke's next words caught her attention. "Your Aunt Rosalia will be arriving soon." Jeanette's eyes widened. "Really?" Duke Alpheus gave a small nod. "She will stay in the capital for some time. Perhaps she can help you navigate the court better." His tone was calm, but there was an underlying meaning in his words. Jeanette understood immediately. Aunt Rosalia could be the key to helping her gain more recognition. Rosalia had once been a prominent figure in high society, before she chose to step away. She was the one who had taken Jeanette in after her mother, Penelope Judith, had died, ensuring that she was hidden and raised safely. If there was anyone who could help Jeanette become more refined, more fitting of her title, it would be her. Jeanette felt a small spark of hope. "Have you received any invitations to social gatherings?" the Duke asked. "I have," she admitted, but then scoffed. "But nothing worthwhile. They're all from low nobles." The Duke gave her a measured look. "The Emperor's banquet is coming up soon. Hopefully, your aunt will arrive before then." He set his empty cup down with a quiet clink against the saucer. "Make sure to put your best foot forward." Jeanette nodded, her hands clenching slightly in anticipation. "I understand, Uncle." A grand event such as the Emperor's banquet would be her perfect chance. If she played her cards right, if she presented herself well enough, then surely, the Emperor would finally see her. Finally, he would acknowledge her as his daughter. Unbeknownst to the Duke and Jeanette, the faint murmur of their conversation had not gone unheard. In the quiet hallway, a group of maids stood, discreetly listening behind the door. The sound of soft voices reached their ears as they exchanged quick glances, eager to share what they had overheard. As they moved away from the door, the sound of footsteps echoed along the marble floor. The maids hurried to intercept Lucas, who had just returned from the magic tower. He was dressed in his usual black suit, his short hair neatly combed, his ruby eyes glinting with a sharp intelligence that sent a ripple of excitement through the maids. Despite his youth, there was an undeniable charisma about him that had them all captivated. "Master Lucas, I have new news," one of the maids said, her voice trembling slightly in excitement. She was eager to share, but before she could continue, another maid rushed to hush her. "No, I want to be the one to tell him," the second maid said, pushing the first one aside. Lucas raised a brow, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Ladies, please. Let's not stand by the door like that," he said with a teasing smile, his voice low and smooth. The maids immediately flushed at his attention, unable to contain their giggles and blushes. Despite the difference in age, they were enchanted by his presence. The maids quickly gathered themselves and led Lucas to the dining room. The room was lavish, with an intricate crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the long, polished oak table. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting the royal family's history, and the soft hum of conversation could be heard from the kitchen staff as they prepared the next course. As the maids served Lucas a 5-star, 3-course meal, they began to gossip about what they had overheard. Lucas, ever the attentive listener, picked up on every word, his expression still and focused as he sipped his wine. "Can you believe her?" the first maid began, her voice full of disdain as she set a dish in front of Lucas. "She is always complaining about something. She's nothing but a spoiled girl." The second maid nodded in agreement, her tone sharp. "And the way she called our young master arrogant, it's a shame that she herself has nothing to be arrogant about." Lucas's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes betrayed the coldness beneath. He knew exactly what they were referring to, Jeanette's arrogance and her attempts to position herself as a princess. But Lucas had been careful. He had made sure to keep her at bay from the moment she arrived at the palace. He would not let her charm her way into favor. "She thinks she's entitled to everything," the first maid muttered, her voice low, but loud enough for Lucas to hear. "She even complained about the servants." "The servants? Can you imagine?" "She doesn't understand her place," the second maid added, shaking her head as she poured more wine into Lucas's glass. "She's just a poor little girl pretending to be royal." The gossip continued, the maids eagerly sharing every small detail of Jeanette's interactions with them. It was clear that, despite being a guest at the palace, Jeanette had already begun to rub the staff the wrong way. But then, the conversation took a turn. The head maid, Margaret, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Did you hear? Countess Rosalia is coming to the capital soon." At the mention of her aunt's name, Lucas stiffened. His ruby eyes narrowed, a flash of anger coloring his expression for the briefest of moments. The glow of his eyes grew more intense, and the red hue that spread across his face was unmistakable. The maids, who had been gossiping light-heartedly moments before, fell silent, aware that their master had grown serious. "She's planning to help her niece?" Margaret asked with a knowing smile, seeing the look on Lucas's face. She was careful with her words, but even she could sense the tension building in the air. Lucas turned to her, his smile tightening into something more dangerous. "Reserve a room for Countess Rosalia," he said coldly, his voice carrying a hint of command. Margaret blinked in surprise. "Master?" she asked, her brows furrowed in confusion. Lucas's gaze remained sharp as he stared at the maids. "I'd rather she stay here, where we can keep a close eye on them," he said, his tone laced with an icy resolve. The maids understood instantly what he was implying. They could not let the Countess or Jeanette gain any foothold in the palace. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a calm, almost pleasant smile as he looked at the head maid. "Let's make sure the Countess stays here," he added, his words final. "After all, the more we know about her, the better." "Yes, of course, master," Margaret replied swiftly, her voice eager as she looked around at the other maids. They all nodded, more than willing to follow Lucas's orders. The maids giggled quietly among themselves, knowing that their loyalty to Lucas had already been well established. Since Jeanette's arrival, Lucas had made it clear that no one in the palace should be swayed by her charms or her unrefined ways. He had gone out of his way to ensure that she remained isolated, and even the staff had come to understand that their loyalty lay with him, not the young noblewoman. As the maids continued to serve Lucas, the dining room was filled with an eerie sense of control. The soft clink of silverware and the hum of conversation were distant sounds, drowned out by the unspoken tension in the room. Jeanette had no idea what was brewing behind closed doors, but Lucas was already one step ahead of her, and he was determined to make sure she remained nothing more than an outsider in the palace. Midnight visit to the Emerald Palace. The night was quiet, an eerie stillness hanging in the air as the moonlight poured through the balcony doors of Princess Athanasia's room in the Emerald Palace. The moon's soft glow bathed the room in silver light, casting long shadows across the lavish furnishings. The quiet creak of the doors opening disturbed the silence, but no one stirred. Lucas stepped inside, his black suit blending into the dark shadows of the room. His ruby eyes gleamed in the darkness as he moved silently across the floor toward the princess's bed. He paused, just for a moment, watching her sleep, her blonde curls spilling across the pillow, her delicate features softened in peaceful slumber. Lucas sat down on the edge of her bed, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face, highlighting his well-defined jawline and the intensity of his gaze. His red eyes glowed brighter as he studied her with an intensity that would have unnerved anyone who dared look directly at him. The air seemed to shift around him as a faint pulse of dark energy rose. His black hair began to flutter as the shadows surrounding him grew, slowly engulfing his form. In an instant, the figure of the young boy seemed to fade, replaced by something more powerful, more dangerous. The boy, Lucas, was gone. Now, a man sat before the princess, tall and imposing, with long black hair cascading down his shoulders like dark silk. His ruby eyes shone like molten gems, their cold beauty mesmerizing as he continued to gaze at Athanasia. His eyes softened slightly, his features less rigid than before, and a faint smile tugged at his lips as he reached out to gently brush a strand of her wavy blonde hair from her face. The moment his fingers made contact, a soft glow emanated from her hair, almost like an ethereal light, as if the princess herself was imbued with a radiance that responded to his touch. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable for a brief moment as he looked at the princess, the air around them thick with unspoken emotions. In a low, almost reverent voice, he spoke, the words meant only for her, "Don't give up. I will protect you." His words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken promise. The beauty of the sleeping princess before him was so delicate, so pure, and yet, Lucas, now the man, knew what dangers lay in the world outside her chambers. He could see the fragility of her life, the uncertainties that surrounded her existence. And yet, as his gaze softened, the shadows around him seemed to bow in submission, as if acknowledging his power, his claim over this very moment. Suddenly, the vision before him changed. The image of the helpless little girl, Athanasia, began to shift in his mind. In the blink of an eye, the young princess seemed to fade away, replaced by the woman she was destined to become. She was no longer the innocent, vulnerable child. Before him now lay a beautiful woman, radiant and full of potential, yet still bound to the forces that sought to control her. Lucas took a deep breath, leaning closer to her, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke again. "One day, you will see what you are truly capable of. Until then, I'll be here, watching over you." He lingered there for a few moments longer, unable to tear his gaze away from her face, his eyes filled with a quiet longing, a need to protect her. The man's presence was overpowering, yet strangely tender in this moment, as though he truly meant every word he had spoken. Finally, with a single, soft exhale, he stood from her bedside, the shadows once again wrapping themselves around him. He looked down at her one last time, as if committing her to memory. As he turned to leave, the darkness that had swirled around him receded, but the air still felt charged with the weight of his promise. The door closed silently behind him, leaving the princess untouched in her peaceful slumber. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.